Welcome very much to this first Fletcher conference on sport and diplomacy. I'm just really pleased that we're having this. It's an important subject aside from the World Cup. But yesterday, the World Cup opened in Qatar for the first time in its 92-year history, having a tournament in the Middle East. 92 years ago, it was Uruguay that beat Argentina in the final on home turf. I don't think after yesterday's game, anybody believes that Qatar is going to emulate that. But it is an important story of how the game has spread. Of course, as a Brit, I am convinced that football will come home again for the first time since 1966. As you know that there's a British definition of football. It's football, not soccer, by the way, which is that 22 people run around a turf pitch for about 90 minutes chasing a ball, and then Germany wins. But for football to be a national sport in Qatar or in Uruguay, or anywhere else for that matter, means that you have to delve into questions of national identity, of colonialism, of popular movements, and control, often authoritarian control. As a kid, I was told fiercely by my grandfather that when it came to football, one supported England, and when it came to rugby, one supported Wales. That's true, except for this afternoon, and I was very glad to see Wales draw against the United States, putting the US in a difficult position in Group B for the rest of the tournament. Sports have strong class and cultural context where I come from, I think across the world. And that's true at club and at national level. But these games have forced an evaluation of mega sports in a way perhaps not before. I remember more than 12 years ago when the games were awarded, talking to Sharon Burrow as she then assumed control of the International Trade Union Federation, which she's stepping down from in the next few weeks, as she started to travel to Qatar to talk to the Qataris about issues of labour rights and how they would actually construct these stadiums. Much of what she warned of at that time has come true. I also worked with John Ruggie, recently deceased, but who had written the Principles for Business and Human Rights for the UN, as he became engaged with Qataris again on what needed to be a framework for the hosting of these games, but also in a futile attempt to get FIFA perhaps to take some of these issues on in a different way. So some of the controversy of the last few weeks as we've just come up to this World Cup is not new, and there have been people working on these issues for years, quietly trying to wrestle with mega sports and mega events. And below the surface of the immediately apparent issues of workers' rights are issues of money and sponsorship, of political projection, political power, and of the way in which we organize our international sports. There's also an environmental dimension to this. One looks at the carbon footprint of this event and what's been spent on it, and FIFA's claim that it is in fact carbon neutral. And it would probably take, I don't know, half a class for most Fletcher students to be able to take that carbon neutrality claim to pieces and lay it bare. What they have done is agreed to offset most of the emissions that come from the total event. And most of those emissions actually don't come from the stadiums that have been constructed, but from the flying in and the other issues related to the way in which the games are being managed. But those multiple billions of tons of carbon are to be offset in in a FIFA organized offsetting scheme, which is not open to international scrutiny or to any kind of transparent reporting. Therefore, I think we've concluded that that claim of carbon neutrality actually is false. So I think these games, perhaps more than any others, have been examined from every possible angle, and for many people have been found wanting. But this is an issue of great national pride for countries all over the world and for people all over the world. It isn't just obviously the World Cup, though that's what we're talking about today, but we can look at all international large sporting events, to all international federations of sports, and of course to the Olympics for some of the same issues. So you don't need me to go on about this, although I could talk for hours and hours and hours about the future, the faster football and the future of it. But I'm grateful to Tara Sonenshine and to the events team led by Janina for putting the event together today, and to all of our speakers for coming and participating. I'm also really pleased to see so many people from across the Tufts community and friends and family, including Gabby, I don't know if he's still here, Alvarado, and then Gary and Yale friend, Tara's family. So it is a family event. And then I think just final reflection, it was kind of strange to look at the stadium yesterday and today and see so few women in the stands. And of course, this morning, watching England play Iran, it was profoundly sad to see so many Iranians in the stadium in tears, with mixed feelings about supporting that team, and to see on the faces of the Iranian team the contrasting emotions as well for playing for their country this time. So this cuts deep in many different ways, and let's take it apart now. Tara, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Kyte, and would you join me in a round of appreciation? The bios are all in your programs, and the panelists are simply the best and brightest. Would you join me in a warm Fletcher Tufts welcome for our panelists here and on Zoom? Our first segment is definitional. What does soccer football mean to a country, to athletes who play it, to economists who study it, to foreign policy, human rights thinkers? Carlos, what does it mean to Costa Rica?
Thanks for inviting me. I think it's a brilliant event. The generation of my dad will say that the public sphere was religion, politics, and football.
Religion, politics, and football in one sentence.
And I believe in my generation is football, full stop. Because people care less about politics nowadays, and religion, yeah, it started to be so relevant, particularly in our context. There's one author in Latin America which I recommend everybody. It's called Eduardo Galeano from Uruguay, and he wrote a lot about football because he was a hardcore fan, but also very critical. And I quote him saying that football is like a god in our countries. You have lot of people, lot of believers, and you have the intellectuals a skeptic about it. He will say that, and I think it's true. It has a lot to do with identity. It's something, and he said it was something like a sublimation of war for our identities.
Sublimation of war. Professor Chidi, take me into Nigeria and civil war and soccer. When I came to visit you, you told me of a team called the Rangers. I didn't know much about, but you mentioned war in the same phrase as soccer. Why?
Yeah, I think thanks a lot as well. It's great to see the community gathered. I was just complaining about to one of our colleagues here that the World Cup is not something you watch alone. It's a community undertaking, and it's great to see a community around this as the World Cup begins. Yes, indeed. Football was introduced to most of Africa by the Brits as part of the colonial enterprise. And they used it as a mechanism of identity framing. And in a lot of our African countries, it's the same. So in Kenya, for instance, the Luo team is called Gor Mahia. And the Luya team is AFC Leopards. In Nigeria, the Igbo team is Enugu Rangers. The Yoruba team is IIC Shooting Stars.
Rangers or the Rangers?
Rangers. Rangers International. In South Africa, for instance, you have the Chiefs and the Orlando Pirates, right? In Ghana, you have Accra Hearts of Oak and Ashanti Kotoka. But let me return to Nigeria. The biggest damage that war does to any community is here. It's in the mind, it's in a sense of dignity, particularly in that civil war. At the end of the Nigerian Civil War, there was a community that lost and there was a side that won. that side that won reconstruction in Nigeria was not done by government. It was done by Enugu Rangers International,
By sport,
by football in particular, not just sport, football.
to unify.
No, the community, the Igbo community who were defeated in the war used football to rediscover dignity and the idea that they can win again and to work their way into integration with Nigeria. So the war ended in 1970. Rangers International was a recce team that of young men who were supposed to be disbanded at the end of the war. They were turned into a football team and they became Nigeria's biggest football team. Basically the core of Nigeria's gold medal winning team in the football event in the All Africa Games 1973, and the core of Nigeria's Africa Cup of Nations winning team in 1980. It propelled careers, it propelled political careers, business enterprises, the entire rebuilding, reconstruction of the southeast of Nigeria following the Nigerian war was, in one word, Enugu Rangers.
Respect, was that part of it?
Absolutely, yes.
So respect and power. I come to the leading sports economist in the world, Professor Andrew Zimbalist. For the nation who hosts this, it must make them so wealthy. Yes?
Well, before I talk about that, if you're going to read Galeano, you should read Open Veins of Latin America, as well as his soccer or football books, excuse me, football. So
Does it make Qatar wealthier?
that's what we're going to talk about. I've brought some slides. I think it'll be easier to apprehend the complexity of it with the slides. I don't think any country has benefited much economically. A few countries, such as Germany, when they don't have to construct anything because they already have all of the stadiums and they have the infrastructure, they can make out okay. But when you bring the World Cup to a less developed country or a country that doesn't have a tradition in soccer, and you basically have to build everything from scratch, it doesn't work out very well at all. Until these games, the most expensive World Cup games were in Brazil in 2014 and Russia in 2018. And they spent both, the numbers are a little murky, but somewhere just south of $20 billion. What we have in the case of Qatar, and there have been different reports, and just the other day, or I think it was yesterday, Bloomberg came out with a report saying they're spending $300 billion, but the numbers most frequently cited are between 177 and $250 billion.
Spending, that's what the country is spending.
Now, of that, somewhere between $6 and $10 billion was for 7 stadiums that they built from scratch and 1 stadium that they renovated. 36 billion is for a new metro that they built around the town or the city of Doha. And 16 billion is for a new airport. They also built somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 hotels and massive transportation and communications infrastructure. Putting that in perspective, the entire Qatari economy, the GDP of Qatar last year was 180 billion. They've spent somewhere around $220 billion by most figures. So they spent more than the GDP. They spent it over 12 years because the games were awarded in 2010. So they spent 18.3 billion a year, which is a little bit more than 10% of their yearly economy. That would be the equivalent of the United States spending $2.3 billion a year for $12 trillion, $2.3 trillion a year for 12 consecutive years. What about the revenues? Well, it turns out that the way the economics of this is structured, FIFA keeps all the revenues. The biggest bundle of revenues comes from television, $2.64 billion, just around 55% of total revenues from television. Then marketing and sponsorship rights, $1.35 billion, and ticket sales and hospitality under $1 billion. So the total amount of revenue that comes in just from the World Cup is $4.7 billion. FIFA keeps that. And what FIFA does do that the IOC doesn't do in the case of the Olympics is they cover all the operating expenses. The largest operating expenses is paying bonuses out to the teams that win. The winning team gets $42 million, and the 16 teams that don't qualify or that don't emerge out of the group phase, they get $9 million each. So the total amount of payments, $440 million. The last Women's World Cup, which was in 2019, the total amount of payouts was $30 million. So the women got 1/16 then as much as the men are getting this year. But in any event, the total, if you add up all of the, okay, so you've jumped ahead, but that's fine. No, go back a little bit. Yeah, so the total revenues that are going to FIFA are $4.7 billion, more or less, and the total expenses that they're putting out are $1.7 billion. So that leaves a $3 billion cushion. And that money, basically around 10% of that goes to the administration of FIFA. And the rest of it goes to the 205 soccer federations around the world to develop the sport of soccer.
Can I
Yeah,
pause
yeah.
here? Those are big numbers. Do those numbers scare anybody? Those are big numbers.
Gap in finance of climate, obviously, what we need to develop the global south. Yeah, but that's the power of football. It's the power to mobilize those quantities, but also the symbolic power. It's not only the economic, actual, factual power. It's also had to do with the symbolism that goes with it.
Nigeria, you could do a lot with that.
Well, it's a difficult question to pose to a Nigerian because when you, I don't want to encourage stereotypes here of any place, but when you think about the kinds of things that some of our politicians or indeed previous military rulers have exported to Switzerland and other parts of the world, those numbers are middling somewhat, sadly. The reality, though, I think, and I want to put this up front, is I hesitate about all this dumping on Qatar because, look, the World Cup has been in existence for 92 years, or thereabouts, over which we've had 22 hosts. Only 4 hosts have been outside Europe and Latin America. United States in 1994, South Korea, Japan 2002, South Africa 2010, and now Qatar. And the World Cup has never been choir practice. Okay? In 1930, Estadio Centenario, which hosted the final, was constructed specifically to host the finals in Uruguay. And Uruguay paid the costs of every country that came to the World Cup in 1930, and it won it. In 1934, Il Duque, Mussolini, hosted the World Cup. The following year, he invaded Ethiopia on my continent. And the year after that, Adolf Hitler hosted the Olympics. So if we are going to dump on Qatar, let us all go back and dump on the rest of the world and be open about dumping and not pick on people because they look different. That is my problem with this dumping.
And we're going to go into that, but I want to come back and let you continue because you stunned us with the numbers.
Well, so if on the one hand, you've got an expenditure that's on the order of 200 or $220 billion, what comes back to them? The money itself from the World Cup goes to FIFA, as I said. What does come to Qatar is they're going to have some visitors. The estimates are between 1 million and 1.3 million visitors to the country. If each of those spends 4 days, each of the visitors spends 4 days in Qatar and spends $300 a day, it would come to $1.8 billion of revenue. That's not a very good balance sheet. You have the revenue coming in of 1.8 billion and you have going out $220 billion. Presumably some of that $220 billion, such as the building of a new airport, maybe the construction of the metro, that will contribute to the ongoing development of the society. So we shouldn't say all of that money is for the World Cup because it has some ongoing value. But even if you say that half of it has ongoing value, you're still looking at a terribly lopsided situation. And you're going to have, at the end of the games, you're going to have a lot of pain and more expense because you're going to have 7 stadiums, new stadiums that didn't exist before. Why didn't they exist before? Because there was no economically viable reason for them to exist before. There's not going to be an economically viable reason for them to exist 30 days later. In the meantime,
you can repurpose them.
they could be, well, 2 of them are going to be dismantled, actually. Yeah. 2 of them are going to be dismantled and shipped elsewhere, which will cost money. But the ones that stay in place, you'll have to do maintenance, you'll have to do operations expenditures, millions of dollars for each one. and it's occupying real estate that could have other uses. So it doesn't make a lot of sense economically. If there's any rationalization for it at all, it would have to be in what we'll be talking about later, which is soft power. But I don't think the record there is very positive either.
Okay, we have two Fletcher football players. And I knew this would happen. You hear all this discussion and you just love the game. Lauren Pranjal, tell us a little bit about how you approach soccer and leave all this global stuff aside.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak on this panel and really giving me an excuse to talk about one of the things that I love the most, which is soccer, football. And yes, there's nice, embarrassing pictures of me up on the screen.
So we decided you can all say, oh, is to put some photographs of our players. Come on, everybody. Oh. Go ahead.
Yeah, so as you can tell from these pictures, I started playing football when I was very, very young. I was around 3 years old. And I grew up in the United States in the 90s during a time where football was really just starting to take off. I think that this is really encapsulated by sort of three key moments. The first, Professor Chidi, you've already mentioned, which was in 1994 when the Men's World Cup was hosted here in the United States. The second was in 1996 when the U.S. women won gold at the Atlanta Olympics. And then the third, of course, in 1999 when the Women's World Cup was hosted here in the U.S. and won by the United States. And actually, one note on the Atlanta Olympics relevant for our conversation later on inclusion. This was the first time that women's soccer was played at the Olympics. It had been a game for men since 1900. So it only took 96 years for the IOC to do it. Perhaps that's a conversation for our next sports and diplomacy conference. Yeah, so sort of the buzz that was generated by these three big events led to huge investments being made to develop the game here in the United States, particularly at the youth level. I think it's important to note that this is not the case in other parts of the world, and access to the game is not equitable. And so in many ways, I'm very, very lucky to, one, have grown up in at this very exciting time for the sport in the US, in a town where there were opportunities for girls to play, and also to have parents who encouraged me and recognized that sport could have a really positive impact on the lives of young people.
Go parents. A round of applause for parents.
So I'll take up from where Lauren leaves. I'm from India, where football is a widely followed sport, but not a widely played sport. So I'm from a small town where I did not have access to facilities per se. So it was when at the age of 8 that I moved to a colonial era boarding school, which was a British boarding school, and I had a strong tradition of football. It is there at the age of 8 that I started to play football. And highlighting her point again, that is why I feel blessed that I got the opportunity to play. But many in my country and many parts of the world don't have access to basic sporting facilities. So the hope is that FIFA, with all its influence and money and power that we talk about, can make the sport reach to different ends of the world.
So this leads us right into a segment that we're going to do on Qatar and what is really happening on the ground. And to help us understand this, I turned to the Financial Times, to Simon Cooper. Any of you follow the sport know that he's one of the leading journalists tonight. He is in Qatar, but he spoke with us a little bit before departing. So we'll take a listen to Simon.
Hi, I'm Simon Cooper. I'm a columnist at the Financial Times, and I've written various soccer books, including Soccernomics and the Barcelona Complex. I also have happy memories of Tufts from nearly 30 years ago, when I sometimes took courses at the Fletcher School and waited at the extremely cold bus stop. I've seen a World Cup that's starting under such a cloud. I mean, understandably and rightly, the publicity has very largely been negative about Qatar's bad treatment of migrant workers, inequality of men and women, the banning of homosexuality in Qatar. And the Qataris say, you know, with some reason, that they have improved on migrant rights, at least, not on the other categories, and Amnesty and the International Trade Union Confederation would back them up. They have actually been pushed into making some reforms, too little and too late, on migrant rights. But essentially, they're getting no praise at all, and everybody is very understandably and rightly pointing out all the terrible things about the Qatari system.
Well, with that, I'm going to welcome on Zoom two of the leading experts on this subject. Natasha Iskander, she's with us, is a lead author. And also, if we're able to get on Zoom from very far away, is Nick McGeehan with Fair Square, a nonprofit looking at these issues. And I have no idea, but oh my goodness, welcome Natasha and Nick. We welcome you. So Natasha, tell us about your project that led up to where we are today.
Thank you so much, Tara, for this invitation and for this great conversation about the cup. I want to say what a delight it is to be here tonight and what a delight it is to share the Zoom with Nick, who's done such tremendous work, really highlighting some of the issues around worker rights and worker health and safety on Qatari construction sites. I am the author of a book called The Skill Make Us Human: Migrant Workers in 21st Century Qatar and Beyond. And the book, the impetus for the book grew out of the kind of work that Nick is doing, noting the prevalence of human rights violations on Qatari construction sites. So after Qatar was awarded the World Cup hosting rights, it said to the world, come and see how we operate, and the world did, and documented an array of human rights violations that workers faced, everything from chronic wage theft, to forced labor, to forced overtime, to injury and death, to abysmal living conditions in labor camps, and much more. And much of this coverage attributed these conditions to the kafala system, which really, although it has acquired a reputation of being something that is uniquely Arab, unique to the region, is actually nothing more than a temporary labor framework for migrant workers, and is not in its bones dissimilar from temporary guest worker frameworks around the world. But in any case, Qatar's version of this temporary labor framework was amongst the most restrictive in the region. And at the time Qatar was awarded the World Cup, workers could not change jobs. They could not withhold labor for any reason. So not only could they not quit jobs, but they could not decide not to work if they weren't being paid or if the working conditions were dangerous or abusive. They could not leave the country at will. They required an exit visa from their employer. There was no minimum wage, and wages were indexed to the level of poverty in the country of origin. And the power structure was such that employers could deport and have workers detained basically at will. So the framework really empowered employers over their workers and curtailed the rights of workers in dramatic ways. And this was something that organizations around the world drew attention to. What I was interested in was the politics that happened within the envelope of this regulatory structure. Regulatory structures are not prescriptive. They create the conditions for certain kinds of politics at the work site. And I wanted to understand what those politics were, to understand how these exploitative conditions were produced. A lot of the narratives continue still to say that this is a problem of bad actors, but that is rarely the problem. Generally, the problem is structural. There are certainly bad actors. There are bad actors in every economy, but the problem is that the most difficult problem to solve is structural, and has to do with the politics at the site. Sorry, go ahead, Tara.
Yeah, if you can explain the skilled versus unskilled.
Getting to that in just a second.
Good.
Thank you. So what I did was that I went to Qatar and I conducted research on the construction industry. So just to establish my street cred here, I talked to government, I did an industry analysis, I talked to managers, engineers, supervisors. I conducted 120 worker interviews, and I spent hundreds of hours on these construction sites to understand what these politics looked like. And what I discovered was a really fundamental tension around structured by the politics of skill. And it was this. Construction in Qatar happens at the global technological frontier. This is some of the most sophisticated engineering and design anywhere in the world. It really happens in ways that are being developed as the structures are being built. Not just the finished structures, but the process of construction is in many cases, has in many cases not been seen anywhere else in the world. It's highly innovative and highly difficult, highly technically complex. And yet the workers who arrived in Qatar often arrived with very little construction experience and certainly nothing comparable to what they were asked to perform in Qatar. And what this meant was that companies, in order to construct these buildings, had to be organized as vast training systems. They provided accelerated training to the workers that they recruited. And the training, the upskilling of workers, structured production even more than the goal of actually producing the building. Every single production task was structured around training and upskilling workers so that within a very short time, workers became master scaffolders, master welders, master cladders, master electrician, and the list goes on. And yet when I asked managers who measured the skill development of their workers, sometimes several times a day, to fine-tune these learning structures, they all describe these very skilled at the technological frontier workers as unskilled. So to me, it became very clear very quickly that skill was not, the concept of skilled or unskilled had nothing to do with actual ability. It was a political category. And it was a political category that justified the exploitation of workers. And let me just very briefly, before I close, take you into the logic of that. In denying that these workers had become skilled, had become master craftsmen, they were in essence denying learning. And anyone who has ever been a student or has ever been a teacher knows that learning is fundamentally an act of freedom. You can compel someone to do something, you cannot compel someone to learn. Learning requires imagination, it requires desire, it requires connection, it requires effort, it requires a whole series of human registers, but most importantly, it requires volition. So in denying that workers had the capacity for these registers, they were in essence denying that workers had the full capacity for freedom associated with political personhood. And then, you know, if you deny that someone has the capacity for something, it becomes very easy to legitimate the denial of that freedom, the denial of that dignity, the denial of the right to work under fair working conditions. So this meant that even after Qatar instituted reforms starting in 2017, but really actually functionally closer to 2020, the politics have remained the same. And that has meant that the reforms in practice have had very little effect. So the kinds of rights that workers now have, they can now change jobs. There's now a very low minimum wage. They can technically quit their jobs and leave the country if they like. All of these rights are almost impossible for workers to attain, to take advantage of, to exercise. And what that means on the ground is that they continue to suffer very difficult and exploitative working conditions, from chronic wage theft all the way through chronic injury as the result of heat. And I'll let Nick take it away from here.
Thank you, Natasha, from all of us for your work. I know that you had to experience your own forms of harassment after publishing the articles, and we in this audience thank you for that overview. So Nick, I hate to be morbid, but you and I talked a lot about death in our conversation, and I would like you to discuss that with us.
Okay. Somebody at Amnesty once called me Dr. Death as well. That name is stuck there. Thanks for having me on, and thanks. It's great to be on with Natasha, who has the ultimate street cred on this. Yeah, deaths. I guess deaths became a big issue in Qatar, let's say around 2013. And The Guardian did a big story. The story that probably put this issue into the global spotlight, really. And it was the images of young men going back in coffins to their families, to their grieving families in Nepal, which really caught the world's attention in a way that previous exposures of this issue just hadn't done. So deaths was always the issue, I think, that really was prominent in a lot of people's minds. And then quickly the issue shifted to numbers. You know, how many have died? Everyone needs a metric to to calculate the scale of any tragedy, and people wanted to know how many workers had died. The problem was that we couldn't really get that information. So there was a lot of speculation from certain groups about how many workers would die in stadiums based on current death rates. And a debate started off in about 2013, actually. It was heavily covered by the Washington Post at the time, maybe 2014. And it was about the numbers. Now, I was at Human Rights Watch at the time as this debate was going on, and it struck me as quite unhelpful. Trying to say how many have died was obscuring the debate that we should be having, which is, can we ascertain what level of protection exists and whether the level of protection is adequate, and whether more steps need to be in place to mitigate these risks that workers are exposed to. So to try and take a risk prevention approach rather than trying to calculate the scale of the tragedy. And that's what got me interested in migrant worker deaths, I guess. And I did the last piece of work I did when I was a researcher at Human Rights Watch was a piece on this very issue in late 2017. Now the issue again went into the spotlight last year. I think it was March 2021. With an article that I'm sure you all have seen, which was the Guardian story about 6,500 workers having died in the 10 years since Qatar had been awarded the tournament. There was a lot of controversy about the issue because I think it was misinterpreted by many. In some cases, I think that was unintentional misinterpretation. In some cases, I think there was willful misinterpretation of it, to say that 6,500 workers had died building stadiums. Now, the Guardian never said that at all in their article. They were just identifying the death toll because at the time there was a knowledge gap of the death toll. We didn't know how many had died, and the Guardian was filling that gap. But the fact that they led again with the number meant that again we were into this very unhelpful debate about how many have died. He said 6,500 and the Qatari said 3 in the end. So my organization has been trying to
Sorry, they said 3. Qatar said 3.
The Qatar World Cup, the Supreme Committee, its public relations response to the Guardian's article of saying 6,500 is they say 3 have died. 3 workers have died in accidents on stadium construction. That's where they get that figure from. It ignores the workers who didn't die in accidents or who died in what they call non-work related incidents on stadiums, and ignores the other 99% of the construction workers in Qatar, many of whom were there for the World Cup. So my organization, I guess, has continued to work on this issue. We looked at the issue not just in Qatar, but across the Gulf as a whole, trying to figure out what the risks are. Looking at the data, of course, because the data is tremendously important, not for what it tells us, I think, but for what it doesn't tell us. It's the inadequacy and the inconsistency of the data that is the problem, because if they had good data, or if they released good data, then that would be a wealth of information for public health specialists who could actually analyze it and propose some level of solution or some solutions to the problem, and to prevent more young men, and it is predominantly men, dying needlessly. But yeah, that's I mean, I could probably talk for hours about deaths and throw stats and numbers at you, but essentially the number focus has obscured the problem. And I guess ultimately what we can say is we can prove beyond any doubt that there has been gross negligence in relation to worker deaths in Qatar and the Gulf more broadly. But we cannot put a death toll on that. And the reason we can't is because the Qataris don't do investigations and they don't release data. So it is their own negligence, in a sense, that actually contributes to the fact that we are unable to precisely measure the death toll.
Well, I want to thank both of you. I know it's extremely late, Nick, where you are, and Natasha, I believe you're in Princeton promoting your book, and we will promote the book and Fair Square. And to both of you, as we discuss with students the power of these games, I thank you truly for all that you've done to open a window onto what's happening. Thank you both so much. I will let you go. Thank you. Okay, Chidi, Carlos, Andrew, it's reactions.
I think this is something that we see in pretty much every big sporting event. The casualization of labor is one of them. The violations that come where labor is one. The other is the window into authoritarianism, and violations of rights of expression would be another. I think in many ways it's universal. The point also that Professor Zimblad has made about the economics is not new to Qatar. Estadio Olimpico in Italy is useless, pretty much. Was useless after the Olympics. So these are not things that are Qatar specific. These are big sporting event specific. And the question is the rationality of economics what we judge sports by? Because at some level, part of this is actually that you cannot put dollars and cents to the right to leisure. I mean, this is something that my students in human rights and I
There's
have
no
gone through.
price on.
There is no dollar and cent mark on. There's no way to calculate the benefit of this. And you talk of profit and loss to Gianni Infantino, but I think this is much more than Gianni Infantino and what goes into the pockets of the organization that he heads.
But you mentioned that Costa Rica did benefit economically from engaging in a mega event. So it's not always a loser.
Well, in our case, it was because FIFA requested us to organize the female sub-20 World Cup, and FIFA paid for it. We used the stadiums that there were, but the true benefit, and I think that's where my approach is, the true benefit, it's not necessarily there on the dollars, but it was on the impact. For us, in that case, was to showcase not only the country, but a view and particularly associated to empowering women. What we wanted to showcase was actually relating Costa Rica, human rights, and women in football. The thing that for me, it's at the core of football and politics, is this huge contradiction. There's a huge contradiction. And why is so powerful? Because many of us really love the game and love the emotion. It goes beyond rationality. When you look at your national sport, I mean, we cry and there are villains and there are heroes and there's history being made when we watch a game. And within that huge contradiction, there's lots of politics as well, soft power. I mean, the World Cup in Argentina in '78, in the middle of the dictatorship. The thing is, now we're having this huge discussion around it. But think about 4 years before in Russia. I think we all are rethinking our approach of what meant the World Cup 4 years ago in Russia to the eyes of the invasion in Ukraine now.
But
so
Andrew,
that contradiction for me is the huge thing.
But economics is not contradictory here. FIFA is either a good guy or not a good guy here.
Well, maybe. I think, first of all, to understand what Carlos, as I try to understand what Carlos just said, they hosted the under-20 women's competition in Costa Rica. They didn't have to build stadiums. The operating costs were covered by FIFA. Costa Rica, in my view, is probably the most democratic, the most stable and the most environmentally responsible country in Latin America. And it has a lot of things to showcase. The problem with taking that analysis and transplanting it to Qatar or Russia or Brazil or South Africa in 2010 is that those countries don't shine the way Costa Rica shines along those variables. There's a lot of bad news that comes out, and instead of burnishing your image, you end up tarnishing your image. So the whole notion that Qatar has been involved in this because they want to promote a good image of their country and have new connections around the world, that can only work. Yes, it's going to be seen by 5 billion people around the world on television, but if they're seeing mostly negative stories, or they're just simply watching matches on the pitch, which doesn't show anything about Qatar, then it's very unlikely that they're going to be achieving the soft power and the longer term economic goals that they articulate.
Well, we're about to go to a segment on soft power. I want to let our students say a word or two, but I presume on Zoom we have the 3 leading experts on soft power. Franklin Foer, technology writer from The Atlantic, and I think Derek Shearer is someplace, our former ambassador, and the soccer king that I know some of our students are waiting for, David Goldblatt. Would you welcome all of them to Fletcher? Okay, Derek, you better explain soft power and sports diplomacy.
All right. Well, welcome to Fletcher and to your tough students. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I've been teaching a course on sports diplomacy at Occidental College for almost 20 years. And I've also practiced sports diplomacy as an ambassador. And what it is taking one of the most common human activities, sports, and employing it as part of your diplomatic toolkit. And there are lots of ways that countries have done this. One of the classic ways is the mega sporting event that we'll be talking about later today, the World Cup, but also the Olympics. Berlin in 1936 used it to announce the rise of Nazi Germany. After World War II, defeated Japan used the Olympics in 1964 to announce they were a democratic power that had come back and wanted to play a role in the world. Other countries, of course, have used both the World Cup and the Olympics to sell themselves and their brand on the world stage. Brazil did it with the World Cup and with the Olympics, China with the Beijing Olympics. And as we know with Qatar, you get a lot of attention for these mega events, but it's often critical attention. And we'll be talking more about that.
So let me pause right there. David Goldblatt, that sounds pretty good, this sports diplomacy. You get sports to bring people together. So Russia, the US. David, are you in on that?
We seem to be missing David.
Okay, well, Frank Foer, I'll let you, I know you're going to watch these games on your couch and you're going to be a critic. So I'm going to let you take on Derek.
Okay, well, these events are latched onto not just by, as Derek alluded to, not just by regimes that have benevolent motivations, they're also latched onto by regimes that have less well-intentioned motivations. And we live right now in an age of kleptocracy, where the world is filled with leaders and with billionaires who have built massive fortunes, oftentimes through acts of theft or by capturing the politics of a country, thereby capturing the economics of the country. And one of the things that these kleptocrats do is they try to improve their reputations by they send their kids to the finest boarding schools in the United Kingdom. They put their names on auditoriums. They become benefactors of the arts. And they also attach themselves to this thing that people care most about in the world, which is the game of soccer. And so we've seen this in the English Premier League, where you have Abu Dhabi has bought Manchester City. You had Roman Abramovich, the Russian oligarch, who purchased Chelsea. Saudi Arabia has purchased Newcastle United. And part of the reason that they're doing this is in order to help shape public perceptions of their wealth. And also it's a form of, in their view, of insulation. It's a protection racket, if you will. And I think what Qatar's doing is probably a slightly less malign version of it, yet malign nonetheless, because there are all sorts of things in their country that they would rather not have attention called to. They're competing for hegemony in their region, and this is a means of pursuing power.
So David Goldblatt, what's wrong with a little soft power? What's really, one of our guests said, you know, we beating up on Qatar for no reason. It's soft power.
David, you're
Muted. Wait, David.
David, yeah.
Tara, hello, Tara. I'm not sure I quite understand the question. What's wrong with
What's
soft
wrong
power?
with what Qatar is doing to, you know, improve its image?
I think that's all well and good. What's interesting is how much blowback they're getting. And that's what's really interesting about this World Cup, is that all of the people who've been using football as an instrument of power or sports washing or reputation building for the last 25 years are suddenly discovering that the rest of the world can use it back at them. And actually the Qataris are getting the most incredible level of scrutiny and incredible level of negative publicity, certainly in Northern and Western Europe and North America, than if they weren't hosting the World Cup. I think that's a really interesting, it's very much a two-way flow. Sure, the Qataris are making a case for what they're doing and they have a story to tell, but LGBT activist groups, the NGOs around working on migrant issues, environmentalists and climate activists are all criticizing and calling out Qatar for the limitations of what it's done. So I think it's I'm all for it. I just think we have to recognize, you know, politics is not going out of football and sport. So we're now engaged actually in a political conflict and a political argument. And this one is actually more transparent, more out there and more public than any mega event I can recall.
Derek, you know a lot about Russia, and I know Frank and David feel, when we look back at 2018 and now with Ukraine, do you question soft power and US Russia and all we said that it did during the Cold War?
Well, certainly sports was very important during the Cold War. I mean, there were ways that we could reach out without using war. In the Clinton administration, we used baseball diplomacy with Cuba and wrestling diplomacy with Iran. And of course, with the Soviet Union, there was constant hockey diplomacy, also basketball at the Olympics, but we're not in that Cold War situation. I do think in defense of Qatar, I think Russia got a pass on the World Cup, frankly, David. I don't know if you agree. They certainly got a pass on the Winter Olympics. And as soon as the Winter Olympics ended, Putin invaded Crimea. So, you know, Qatar's a small country relatively. They're trying to develop themselves. And it is good that we criticize them. But boy, if that kind of activity that I think is going on against Qatar had gone against Russia, people would have felt a much stronger response from Putin. But I do want to say that,
because I think, David, you and I talked about it. You feel a little differently about Russia 2018.
Oh, I agree with Derek. Russia totally got a pass. In fact, worse than that, Russia made the 2018 World Cup into a digital Potemkin village. Our screens, you know, both handheld and larger, were filled with images of bacchanalian revelry in public space in Russia. which gave the appearance of a relatively normal country, certainly temporarily burnished its reputation, while at the same time, of course, Navalny and his allies were organizing some of the biggest protests in Russia that we have seen, but all in non-World Cup cities over pension reform, which were then brutally put down. Complete silence from the world's press on this. Silence pretty much on the use of near slave labor of North Koreans in the building of stadiums. And also a country with the most phenomenally anti-LGBT legislation, including the active persecution of LGBT sports organizations occurring in the run-up to the World Cup. And there was virtually silence on all of these issues.
Franklin Four, you're a journalist. Does the media, have we gotten it right where we didn't get it right in the past in shining a light on some of this?
I'd like to think that this is an improvement over 2018 and long history of treating sport as sport and ignoring the political overtones, which are maybe obvious at the time, but considered impolite. And one of the things that I think you see even at this World Cup is that the host nation controls some measure of access, and so we've seen journalists turned away at the stadiums for showing up wearing the wrong T-shirt, or we've seen security cut off reporters in the middle. And so, you know, one of the, I think the problems with sports journalism is that it's historically been a very access-driven form of journalism, and I think that there was maybe not a sense that the ways in which the game is embedded in this larger ecology of society were somehow beyond the limits of sports journalism. And I think that on balance, the media has done a much better job with this tournament.
David and Derek, David, you agree?
I think it depends where you go in the world. I mean, one of the interesting things about this World Cup is how radically different the coverage is depending on where you look. So, you know, the BBC and Telemundo here in the States and German television prefaced their coverage of the opening game with pretty extensive pieces on the problems of workers' rights, LGBT rights, and all of the other issues surrounding the World Cup, and continue to talk about these things in the course of their reporting, whereas Fox, surprise, surprise, is completely and utterly silent on this matter. And in much of the Gulf, including Al Jazeera, it's an overwhelmingly positive interpretation of events. And I think the way in which, for example, Gianni Infantino's pretty extraordinary speech in defense of Qatar earlier this week was reported completely differently in different parts of the world. So there's one World Cup going on in the Netherlands and Denmark, Northern Europe and North America. But in Senegal, in Cameroon, in China, in India, in Iran, these things are being seen very differently.
And finally, and I'll let all of you go, Derek, what do you tell your students at the end of the day is the value of sport and diplomacy being in the same sentence?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I mean, sports is one of the few activities that almost everyone around the world either enjoys directly, plays, or watches. And we have so many examples, and I could just mention a few. We have a sports diplomacy program in the State Department. We've sent, for example, the basketball player Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as a sports ambassador to Brazil, sending a Black American representing us. We send women's teams, we send disabled teams all over the world to engage with people. And at the kind of micro level, when people engage in sports with one another or meet through sports or share ideas, it's incredibly important. So we don't want to let this mega sporting events or the globalization of sports, which Frank, you know, has described, and all the money and all the downside. I mean, you know, if you were to ask me what's driving me crazy, David, about the current World Cup, it's the ads for sports gambling. I mean, Fox, they open everything with how I can make, you know, $50,000 if I only bet on something. And we have sports gambling now reaching out to American university sports. So there are a lot of things that I think we should be upset about in terms of globalization and economics of sports. But, you know, as someone who grew up playing 3 sports, and I still play basketball 3 times a week, where I don't want to give up sports as a way of people interacting.
So thank you all. David, I'm going to let you close this segment because you have gotten me to think the world has a lot of problems beyond this. So I'll give you the last word.
Well, I think the last word is yet to come, and we see how this thing turns out. But I am finding it extraordinary, the level of political conversation that this World Cup is evoking. And it's not just, I would say, the Russians who got let off the hook. Let's not forget Beijing 2022, or indeed Beijing 2008, where the Chinese, despite so many things to be controversial about, managed to almost entirely control access and the narrative. And that has just not been possible for Qatar 2022. And so whatever the football, the political conversation is of a completely different caliber from anything we've seen before.
And who's going to win, David?
Argentina.
Thank you, gentlemen. All of you have a great evening. We thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tara.
Thank you.
Edie, go for it.
In many ways, this segment has been fantastic because it says pretty much all of what I've been trying to say. And I'll say two things that appear to be mutually contradictory in a rather perverse kind of way. Number one, the attention to Qatar is a good thing. We would not be able to get this kind of blowtorching of the situation in that particular part of the world without the benefit of this moment. Having said that, I'll say something secondly rather awkward. There is a touch of racism about the reporting on Qatar because it's different, because it's a society we don't know, because they are the other. We are reporting them from the north of the world in a way that sometimes can be offensive. And I do think that it is necessary for us to challenge the way we treat people who are different from us. Those 2 points can coexist, and I'd like to suggest they do coexist.
Students, you both mentioned diversity and inclusion in our conversations. Pranjal and then Lauren.
So I think diversity and giving people the opportunities to play, despite irrespective of their backgrounds or gender, it all comes down to access and opportunities, which is not always available. And like if I were to cite 2 examples from me as a fan of football, following football and seeing players, 2 refugees who made it big in football. If I would talk about women's football, it's Nadia Nadeem, Afghan refugee who now plays for Denmark and Paris Saint-Germain. And from men's football, Alphonso Davis, who plays for Bayern Munich and the Canadian national team. So when you give people opportunities and you make football more inclusive, people will come out and play, and it would be a more inclusive game.
Lauren.
I think for me, what's been really interesting in this conversation is that I think that there's 2 realities which can coexist. The first, which we've heard, is that football is political, and it always has been. And I think the second is that the game still brings joy to millions of people. And so I think the challenge is to figure out how to ensure that the former supports rather than destroys the latter. And I think that these conversations are really good because what football does is that it shows us that it, like everything else, is part of the broader systems in which we live. And so I think by examining it, it can teach us how to create a more inclusive society. It can reveal these sorts of issues and structural problems within the kind of media that we're consuming, for example, and it can force us to talk about how do we move this from outside of the football pitch into other arenas as well.
Andrew.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Infantino the other day was telling his fellow FIFA people and politicians throughout Europe that they were hypocrites. They were hypocrites because they were criticizing the labor system, the kafala system in Qatar, but they were shutting shutting immigrants off at their border. And so where's their concern for human rights? Where's their concern for human dignity? I think that one of the positive things that I'm perceiving, and as David pointed out, or maybe it was Frank pointed out, that the world depends on where you're sitting, depending on what kind of coverage you get. But certainly in the United States, certainly in Europe, and I'm sure in most of Latin America, there's some very interesting conversations going on about the way we want to structure our labor forces, the way we want to structure our industry. For me, let me just slightly step into another area, because we could talk about the impact that it's having politically on the world. We could talk about the impact politically and culturally and economically it's having on Qatar. But one of the points that I think is really important is that the two main mega event organizations that we've been talking about tonight, FIFA and the IOC, each of them has a tradition, which is every 4 years, they give their big event to a new city. In the case of the Olympics, every 2 years, because they do the Winter Olympics as well. But how can we afford that as a world that's on fire? How can we afford that in the era of climate change to do unnecessary construction? Why can't we have one country, and whether it's the United States or Germany or South Africa, one country that has the facilities and that we go back there every 4 years? I think it was mentioned earlier that we should spread it around. Why should we have it only in the developed world? But if it's established that this doesn't help economically, and that it creates environmental issues and it creates social dislocation in the country where it's happening, it's not a great privilege to be able to host the games. It might be good for construction companies in certain countries. It might be good for politicians who are getting exposure, but it doesn't make it good for the world. It doesn't make it good for the people in those countries.
Well, Latin America and Africa, as we talked about, really had these games until America got in the way, as we talked about. What did we mean when we said Europe, this tug of war, that where they should be? Carlos and then Chidi.
Well, I think there's a sense of, on the bright side, the sense of inclusion, the sense of taking it everywhere so everybody can be part of it. That's somehow in the more subjective level, that sense that we once every 4 years, I mean, everybody can be glued together to one event and, I mean, be one in something and try to agree in a more kind of a peaceful way. On the not so bright side, there are so many things crossing it, so many politics, money, interests, that for me, the word that describe most football and power and politics is contradiction. And I don't foresee a near future in which that contradiction is going to disappear. It might be always, because I think it brings together both our left and right hemisphere in the sense of emotion, things we feel about football that we cannot explain, and the rationality. And there's a contradiction in many of this, because I saw the Netflix FIFA that are out there now, and I feel tempted not to watch the game sometimes. I feel like, no.
Is anyone here tempted not to watch the games?
But then you want to watch them.
So we're going to close out this segment and then open it up to questions from the audience, and we'll be joined by Christine Brennan of USA Today. But Professor Chidi, I'm thinking of Nelson Mandela. If he were here, he said in a letter to the Ghana Football Association when Ghana was up, let's all of Africa root for Ghana. Can we all get on the same page?
We don't need to. I mean, by the way, I'm rooting for Ghana.
And now it comes out.
Just for the record. I'm rooting for Ghana and Cameroon. But seriously, we don't need to, because our world is diverse and that diversity is a good thing. That's the first thing. And, you know, in 1996, I was in the United Kingdom as an exile from my country. And the UK hosted the Euros in 1996. And you just needed to be in the country to understand that this whole conversation about dollars and cents doesn't make sense. Football's coming home, he's coming home, he's coming home, he's coming, football coming. Now, and people, the transformation of the United Kingdom into a multicultural society that happened with the watershed of the elections in May 1997, you cannot talk about without Euro 1996. And you can move this across different parts of the world. The benefits, the coexistence benefits, the political benefits that you cannot compute in dollars and cents. And that really, for me, is this, a Nigerian exile being able to appreciate the transformation of United Kingdom in a society in which he or she is totally different could not have happened if you located this in one country, say Germany or say Switzerland, and invited every other person to go and visit those places every 4 years. I don't think so.
So what we're going to do, folks, is move to the final segment, which is about women. Could not have a soccer program without talking about women, even though they're not in these games. So to get you to that and start thinking about your questions, I've gone back to Simon Cooper and asked him to reflect on women in soccer, and then we'll be joined by the leading authority on women in sports, Christine Brennan. Take a listen.
When I was growing up in Europe in the 70s, in the Netherlands, and later I lived in England, it was sort of assumed that girls didn't play football. It was a boys' game, like gridiron football in the US. And of course, this was ridiculous. But I must admit that I sort of unconsciously and unthinkingly absorbed this. But then when I was 11, I spent 6th grade in Palo Alto because my father was attached to Sanford. So I went to a US school, 6th grade. And on the playground, the girls would play soccer as well. We all played together. And so I saw this very different world where soccer was a unisex game. Then went back to Europe, where at the time it was still only boys. And so to my shame, when my daughter was growing up, I didn't immediately think to send her to a soccer club. And I only did when she was 8. And that's a bit late. My boys started at 6. And she had a very difficult time finding a team. There were very few girls playing in Paris, even just 8 years ago. She played with boys who wouldn't pass to her. So the kind of sexism that has never existed to that degree in US sport. US soccer has some sexism, but not to the degree in Europe. It was really quite, it made her soccer career almost impossible. And that's now changed. So I've seen that change. I live in Paris. I went to the Women's World Cup in 2019 here in France, which was a huge deal. And women's soccer is really taking off finally in Europe too. So the 2 biggest club attendances in European club soccer last year were both for FC Barcelona women's team, who twice drew over 90,000 spectators, which was more than any men's team, including Barcelona in Europe, did last year. So finally, we're getting there. And I must admit that I've sort of only belatedly woken up to the exclusion of women, which I'd always sort of had in the back of my mind without thinking about it. The new updated version of Soccernomics, which is a book by me and Stefan Szymanski, the sports economist, and every couple of years or few years we update it. We've just updated it, and we have a new chapter saying men's soccer owes reparations to women's soccer. Now, why is that? It's not sort of by force of nature that women's soccer around the world is less developed and less lucrative than men's soccer. It's because Men's Soccer Association banned women's soccer in many countries for, on the whole, about 50 years. So this is true in England, it's true in Germany, in France, in Canada, in most of the leading soccer countries. Women's soccer was actively banned in the sense that men's clubs, which of course owned the soccer fields very largely, were banned from allowing women to play on those fields. So if you're a woman, you could only play sort of in the park, with sweaters for goalposts. And there was no money, there were no facilities. And so why in Europe, less in the US, does women's soccer start with such a disadvantage? It's because of those bans. Now, those bans, if you did them now, it would be totally illegal. It's pure discrimination. And so the riches of men's soccer should to some degree be spent to redress this and to put women's soccer in the place where it should always have been. And we see that women's soccer can be tremendously popular. We've seen that in the US, and we're now seeing that in Europe.
So let me invite some questioners to come to the microphones while we move into our final segment. If you would make your questions brief, not long speeches that go up at the end of the sentence. That would be very helpful. And I believe we have somebody heading towards the microphone on this side. You can address your question to any of the panel or just put it out there. Yes, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Richard Offenbacher. I'm a second year MIB student. I guess it's sort of a general question. I know that we've kind of spoken about the, over the evening, but I guess it's a general question of, is the World Cup worth it? I mean, from an economic standpoint, how are they going to make back the, between 177 to 203 $billion? From the diplomacy standpoint, is there enough sort of return on investment that comes out of these games in turn, including the including the Olympics as well? You see dilapidated buildings, Brazil, the Cube in China is still dilapidated. So
worth it?
So is it worth it?
It's not worth it economically. I was trying to make that point. Again, if you're spending $250 billion or $200 billion and you're getting back short-term gains in tourist revenue that are on the order of $1.5 billion, how can you justify that? How can you justify that expenditure of money when the workers aren't being treated decently, when they're not getting paid a decent wage? How can you justify that when they don't have a soccer tradition in Qatar? So if Qatar wanted to play this for soft power, they've been very active in other areas, and I think that been somewhat successful. They now own the Paris Saint-Germain soccer team. That's the strongest soccer team probably in Europe, well, certainly in France today. They own this television station that they set up called beIN that covers the Paris Saint-Germain games. They own the Al Jazeera media network. All of those things, it seems to me, I mean, they're all imperfect in their own ways, but they are spreading the word of Qatar. They're helping Qatar into the world of nations. But this World Cup is not doing that. Let me just quickly say one related thing, which is that we've heard this idea that we have to move the games around because otherwise people won't get to enjoy them. That was true in 1896 when the modern Olympics started. It was true in 1930 when the World Cup started. We're in an era now with international jet power and international telecommunications. We don't have to move the games around every year.
He's not a figure I'd like to cite in this kind of event, but Bernie Ecclestone may have something to say about that. Bernie Ecclestone is the guy who expanded motor racing. And motor racing used to be a European event. Formula One motor racing used to be a very European event. You went to Interlagos, you went to Hockenheim in Germany, and you went to locations, you went to Barcelona, Jerez, and all of that. It was a very European niche thing. Today, Formula One the Formula One season ended yesterday in Yas Marina in Abu Dhabi. And the best circuits are everywhere outside Europe. And Formula One became a multi-billionaire sport and probably the most watched sport in the world when it left Europe. So the European season of motor racing, Formula One motor racing now, takes like 2 months of a 9-month year. Now, why should the world be sending our money to you so that we can come to you and do that? Why can't you come to our countries and do it? It's just a question. There is, and this is also partly about the politics of economics. Now, to do United Nations, we come to the United States. To do human rights, we go to Switzerland. What will the developed world bring to our countries? It's a very straightforward question. And at some point, we've got to address the fact that part of this conversation is a conversation about an unequal world in which the world that counts itself as developed wants to continue to milk the parts of the world that's undeveloped in a very biblical arrangement. Because there is that part of the Bible that says, from those who have nothing, even the little they don't have will be extracted from them and taken to the parts that have everything.
The problem with that perspective is that having sport mega events in the third world is not going to help them economically. It's not going to develop those countries.
Who takes that decision? That is the question. That
Well, you-
decision,
so
it's
what-
not a decision that the world out there can decide for us. No?
Well, it depends which country you're talking about, but generally what happens is that our construction industry interests joined by some architectural interests and some bankers who are going to float the loans and some corrupt politicians who want more exposure. Those are the people who end up deciding.
No, I really think that the world of the North needs to be a lot less arrogant about deciding for people from other parts of the world how things should be done.
Carlos, you better mediate this. Your son, Gabriel's here. He's looking to you to be the peacemaker here. Who should decide when and where games take place?
I mean, and that shouldn't give me any credit. That's important. That's a responsibility, especially for men. So yeah, very important on that. No, I mean, that's why I think it's contradiction. I mean, sure, we would not, I mean, we can agree that we don't want those impacts on environment. We can agree on that and that we don't want that corruption as well. And on the other hand, it will be nice for a change to have certain events happen in other places in the world. Some, for example, in Central America, people have dreamed of a joint world event in the region. What's the middle ground? I don't know. I don't know. Basically, I mean, if we think about the needs for development, for the sustainable development goals, for the climate financing, that it's threatening all of us. I mean, if we were to think about all of those with the same passion we think of football, perhaps we have already solved those. But it's true that that
Ooh.
passion not necessarily is there. I mean, one thing that might be of another might be deviating from the point here, but if you think about the Paris Agreement in the Article 2 that says something that we should, the 193 nations should work together not to have one to increase the temperature in 2 degrees and or try not to be 1.5. I think it says that and not says we should do everything differently of how we've been doing it for the last 200 years, because the first one is more complicated and most people don't necessarily know what they're signing into, even though it means that. If we were to clearly said we should all change what we're doing and how we've been doing it for the past 200 years or more, with you name it there, you could put colonialism, you could put gender issues, you could put violation of human rights, everything. It'll be so complicated to start over. That's why perhaps we use that kind of language. I think in this, the contradiction remain, and hopefully, like the struggle the UN does every day, try to find common ground with all the different voices to make sense out of that.
Well, speaking of different voices, we are joined by Christine Brennan, who will tell us how to be inclusive and diverse and how to make sure that women are part of this conversation. Christine. Christine Brennan, are you there? Not yet. Okay, we'll take another question. While we're waiting, we did tell her 7 o'clock, but I know her. She's probably somewhere. Christine Brennan?
So much. My name is Dishan. I'm a first-year mall student. First of all, I don't think 98% of India can still afford to buy tickets and go to any of the World Cups, let alone the Qatar one. But my question is, would it be more beneficial if we change the discussion to the differences from what if the World Cup had not happened in Qatar? Does it provide more access to the Qatari youth? Does it, the spotlight, does it improve in some level the labor regulations in Qatar? Is it forcing Qatar to improve on multiple platforms that would not have happened in the absence? Do you think that would be a more beneficial discussion for us to have?
Reform.
So I don't think we know yet what's going to happen to the labor system in Qatar. Obviously, they've made some small improvements, not gone very far. But you know, there was a lot of hoopla about the 2008 games in the Olympic Games in Beijing, and the argument was that Beijing is going to want to show the world its best self, and they're going to stop repressing the Muslims in the northwest of the country. They're going to stop repressing the Uyghurs, and they're going to stop doing this and that. And actually, during the 17 days of the Olympics, they did that. And then when the Olympics ended, the repression got worse than it ever was before. So it's one thing when the eyes of the world are upon you and all of the pressure is upon you. And it's another thing when you're behind the curtain again after the games are over. I think that the question that Professor Kyte raised before about who gets to decide whether these things are going to happen in the third world or in one continent, not another, obviously that's a valid question. The problem that I was posing is that when it was decided that Qatar was going to bribe its way to get the games this year, it wasn't the people of Qatar. It wasn't their 300,000 citizens. It wasn't their migrant labor force. And that's what happens very often in these countries. These are not democratic countries. Authoritarian rulers are making the decision, not based upon the interests of those people. So if we can find some way to democratize the decision making, yes, I think it should be spread around.
So with that, I believe Christine Brennan is with us. Thank you so much I know you have CNN and lots to do tonight, but tell us a little bit about the progress women have made in soccer and sports writ large.
Well, thank you, Tara. Thank you so much. Great to be with you, and greetings from the Washington, D.C. area. Yes, as we look at men's soccer, men's football, and obviously that's what this is, a fascinating conversation. I was listening to a little bit of it, and of course, all the issues involved with FIFA putting this World Cup in Qatar, and all of the controversies that will, of course, accompany it, as they should. And I promise I will talk about it every single opportunity I get. I already have 3 different times on CNN, and I'll write some columns about it as well. What an awful decision it was to give the World Cup to Qatar, and how terrible it is. And they deserve all the criticism and all the conversation for sure that they're going to be getting on this. I think it's important, and I'm so glad I'm honored to be here with you and talk a little bit about women's soccer and women's football. And that is an incredible story of success, especially in the United States and now increasingly around the world, in terms of participation, and nations, many more nations, starting to care a little bit, at least, about their women's football. The sexism and the misogyny that we've seen in men's soccer still holds true, but gradually women are making gains, and the United States has led the way. The first World Cup, Women's World Cup, was 1991. First men's World Cup, as you may have said, was 1930, so a big difference there. The United States won that World Cup, and famously or infamously, the story goes that when they came back home, there were 2 reporters waiting at the airport, 2. I was not one of them, by the way. I had no idea that was going on back in 91. And then the next big stepping stone for women's soccer was the 1996 Olympic Games in Atlanta. At that point, women's soccer had not been played at the Olympics. Men's soccer had. And again, that seemed to be okay with the International Olympic Committee until they finally said they need to have a women's soccer tournament. That was held in Athens, Georgia, University of Georgia, during the Atlanta Olympics. And that's where the United States won the gold medal in a packed football field, normally packed for men's football, and this was women's soccer. NBC did not show it live and only showed a couple minutes, and was roundly criticized, and still is criticized to this day, for that awful decision, completely miscalculating the interest in women's soccer back in '96. But the huge event, the huge moment, that packed crowd, a football field full of fans not watching U.S. college football, but watching women's soccer, the impact of that was extraordinary. The organizers of the '99 Women's World Cup, which I believe was the seminal and most iconic event of the first 50 years of Title IX, basically halfway through those 50 years, 27 years after Richard Nixon signed Title IX in June of '72, and 23 years ago. So right smack dab in the middle of those incredible 50 years of Title IX, that event was so big, so huge, because it was held in huge US football stadiums, the Rose Bowl, Soldier Field, FedEx Field in Washington, where the Patriots played, on and on. It was in the biggest football stadiums in the country. And that was a gamble by the organizers, including the great Donna DeVerona, Olympic gold medalist. The organizers decided, based on what happened at the Atlanta Olympics and the full to capacity crowd for that 96 gold medal match, they said, let's go for the big stadiums for 99. And what happened there, of course, those were also filled. I wrote at the time, it was a minivan revolution. It wasn't overhyped. It was moms and dads and their daughters and their sons going to games, buying tickets, wanting their daughters and their sons to see these wonderful women role models who were wearing baggy shorts and baggy shirts and long socks, and were not dressed like pixies or gymnasts or swimmers or figure skaters in beautiful dresses. But the nation still fell in love with these women athletes who were definitely not looking the way previous heroic and popular women athletes had from, say, the Olympics. And those stadiums were full because of 96, 99 ended up having that opportunity to be such an incredible success. And when you're asked at a cocktail party or your next time you're hanging out with friends, what's the only story in the history of news stories to be on the cover of Time, Newsweek, People, and Sports Illustrated in the same week? The only story, Time, Newsweek, People, and Sports Illustrated, it's the 1999 Women's World Cup. Brandi Chastain, a couple of those are just her on the cover. And People magazine was all 20 athletes, 20 members of the team. And one other of them was just kind of all celebrating in the middle of the field. But that story was so huge that it crossed over from sports into our culture in a way that few stories have. The incredible, wildly popular women's soccer team in '99, and from then on, and I would love to take questions, or we can continue to have the conversation. I know I'm speaking quite a bit here, but what happened then? That was really the launching pad. And the next year, 2000 Olympics, I did cover the '99 World Cup in California, and was honored to be there. And then I went to the Australia Olympics in 2000 in Sydney, and I covered several matches of that team. It was absolutely must-see television and must-see events. The U.S. lost to Norway in the gold medal match, and I remember Brandi Chastain, just basically a year after winning that World Cup with that penalty kick, she came out with the silver medal around her neck to the interview area. She wasn't happy, but she wasn't entirely sad. And with that silver medal around her neck, she said, "This certainly isn't the color of the medal I wanted. I wanted to win the gold." Of course, she wanted to win. The US team wanted to win the gold. But she said, "What this shows is the world is catching up. And if we can be the catalyst," she said, "to have other nations start to care about their women's football, women's soccer, and beat us," she said, "as tough as that is for us, it's absolutely a wonderful development in terms of the rest of the world caring about women's sports and the opportunity for women and girls to play sports, and the empowerment and of course the incredible leadership abilities that come from playing sports at a young age, learning how to win at a young age, and even more important, learning how to lose at a young age, and teamwork and sportsmanship." So even at that moment, that team losing the gold, winning the silver that day, once again showed the way in terms of talking about the importance of having the rest of the world catch up, and just class acts all the way. So obviously that catches us up to 2000. There's been a lot more since then, but I'm happy to stop now and take further questions.
Thank you, Christine. So at any point, since I know, Christine, you have interviews to do, we're going to begin to wrap up with a couple of questions. Anyone on women in sports? Yes, go for it.
Hi, thank you for your interesting speech. And do have a question for women football. Basically, so we know today football is getting more and more commercialized. So people not getting, men and women not getting paid equally is because they don't make the same money at the same time. So the issue is, how do we attract more people to watch women football so that they can have the same sponsorship, the same advertisement, and get the same attention. Because I'm from China. China has a rubbish men's football team, but our women football is pretty good. That's the reason to make us watch more women football a lot more. But compared to many other countries in Europe, they have a pretty decent men's football clubs and system. So how do we incentivize them to pay more attention to women's football? Thank you.
No, thank you for the question. I was just in your homeland for the Beijing Olympics in February and previous Beijing Olympics in 2008 as well, and the Women's World Cup as well. So many times in China, and always fascinating. And the storylines there, of course, are extraordinary, whatever the sport is. I think it's happening. I'm an optimist, and the glass is half full, not half empty. From where women's football was, as I said, in 1991, when no one even knew there was a Women's World Cup, to now, it's pretty extraordinary. And certainly in the US, as you alluded to, in the United States, the TV ratings for the women are often bigger than the TV ratings for the men. Because the women win. They win gold medals at the Olympics. They win World Cups. And the U.S. men, I, of course, watched. I'm sure many of you did too, had the 1-1 tie. But who knows how they'll go the rest of the tournament. But, the odds are they will probably not win the World Cup, where next year the U.S. women will be one of the favorites to win the World Cup. So I think these things all take time. It doesn't happen overnight. But the acceptance of women's sports and the interest in women's sports across the board, not just soccer, has been extraordinary. And in basically the blink of an eye in our nation's history, speaking of the United States now, we have fallen in love with what we've created because of Title IX, the law that I referred to earlier that opened the floodgates for women and girls to play sports, including me. And so I think, but I never played soccer. So soccer yet wasn't even a big sport for girls when I was growing up. It was field hockey and basketball and softball and tennis and what have you. And so, I think these things take time. And as I said, I think there's some great things that have already happened. You're right that there are many nations that are behind the United States. I remember Prime Minister David Cameron at the London Olympics in 2012 said that we need a Title IX, he said, in Great Britain, in the UK, because he was watching the US women dominate the Olympics, and women win more gold medals than men on all the US teams in the Summer Olympics. And it's just clear that, that's what the United States has going. But look at England and soccer. Here's the country that invented soccer and then told its women for generations, you can't play soccer. What a idiotic thing to say and do, but that's what England did. And then after the 99 Women's World Cup, I actually was in London, and I was talking to a cab driver. He said, well, women don't play football. And I said, I was just at the Women's World Cup where Brandy Chastain had the winning penalty kick. And he goes, oh yeah, the woman who took off her shirt and whipped it over her head. I said, yeah. And so he knew that. And I said, so you're saying women don't play football? He said, well, English women don't play football. And I said, that sounds ridiculous. And he goes, you're right. That was 99, just one cab driver and me, a little conversation, just an anecdote. But clearly England got the message and realized, what are we doing by preventing women from playing the sport that we love? And now has picked up its game, ramped it all up. They're playing great. They did wonderfully in the World Cup. Obviously, they won the European Championship and just beat the United States in a friendly a couple months ago in England. So in London, bottom line is England now cares about women's football. And when you have Prince William and his daughter, Charlotte, sending videos out about the British women's soccer team, that's huge, because that reaches into corners of the country that people might say, oh yeah, I guess I'll pay attention because the royal family's tweeting and Instagramming about it. Little things like that mean a lot, and it's not a little thing at all. So I do think what we've seen, China care very much about women's football. Of course, China was the team that was in the finals in '99 in the Rose Bowl, as I'm sure you know. Norway, Sweden, Germany, Japan, the usual suspects, right? And what we need is South America, and Brazil has been great, but then Brazil would shut down its women's team and wouldn't let them even practice for 3.5 years, which was just ridiculous and awful. And again, a blatant sexism and misogyny of these countries. What FIFA should have done, if they cared enough about women's football, and Sepp Blatter said he did, but he really didn't. If they had really cared, what they would have done is they would have penalized any national federation for soccer if they didn't start to put more funds into their women's program, and would have said, you can't go to the Men's World Cup if you don't fund your women's team. You'd say 50-50, but let's not even, let's try, give them 20% or 30% as opposed to, pennies, 5%, 10%, whatever. And so FIFA blew it and missed the moment. And now it's happening more organically. And you're right, last point, I know, again, I'm going on, it's hard to know exactly, hopefully I'm not boring everybody there. But the last point I want to make about this is that the US women, of course, now have equal pay. And that was controversial because the Men's World Cup makes so much more money than the Women's World Cup. So the revenue from a Men's World Cup, even for a team that doesn't make the finals, even for a team that, goes out in the, in the first round, it doesn't move on to the knockout stage, is still so much greater than if the women's team wins the whole World Cup. What happened for the women, the US women, to get equal pay? The US men, the guys that you watched play today, they said, we will give up some of our World Cup money to make sure it's equal, completely equal between the men and the women. So those men that are playing for the US national team right now in the World Cup, they're the ones, they're Title IX males. They were raised with their sisters playing sports. They were raised with respect for girls and women playing sports, the way their dads or their grandfathers never did. And those young men several months ago were the ones who said, pay the women equally. We'll give up some of our World Cup money, the international money, the pot of money that's so much bigger for the men than the women. We'll give that up, give it to the women so it's equal. Those are remarkable young men, but they're very, very emblematic, I think, of their generation, and of how men their age, certainly in the United States, but I think many other countries, are beginning to look at women as equals, deserving of the exact same, in this case, equal pay.
Thank you, Christine Brennan, for being with us tonight. We honor your service in covering this, and we're really grateful for your words of wisdom. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask the Dean to come up in a moment and close us out, but I do want to give everyone on this panel a closing thought, anything you've learned this evening or something you will take forth.
I think Lauren and I actually wanted to do a sort of a question with the audience, and we can go ahead with it, just to build up upon inclusiveness and diversity in sports.
Real fast, make it quick. I know, watching the time. But everyone, I want you to think of the answer in your head, and then we'll ask the question. But I'd like for everyone to think of who's the first player that comes to mind when you think soccer. Who's the first soccer player that pops into your head? All right, now raise your hand if that person is a man. Be honest. Okay, now raise your hand if that person is a woman. Okay, so yeah, Mia Hamm, right? And Judy Fowley, yeah, I mean, it's a whole list, right? For those on Zoom who maybe couldn't see, we had about 95% of the audience or so raise their hand that the first person that came into their mind was a man, and only about 5% that said woman. And so I think for us, and one of the conversations that Pranjal and I have had frequently as we're looking right on the screen here at the Fletcher football team from 1992. We've come a long way in terms of inclusion, but I still think that we have a long way to go. But I think for us, one of the things that we've talked frequently about is what are the obstacles, what are the structures which are impeding women, and not just women, what's impeding people who are transgender, people who are non-binary, and other identities from coming out and participating in this game, and what role can we play at Fletcher and elsewhere in making sure that we're ensuring that this game that we love is inclusive for everyone.
Professor Zimbalist, your closing thought. You were going to bring us on a hopeful note. I think I planted that.
Well, I think that the concern that Professor Kyte raised about bringing along less advantaged countries and giving them an opportunity to, I think he was referring to, host the sport mega events. I find it problematic to say that without qualification or to endorse that without qualification. What needs to happen is you can go to the organization, you can go to the IOC, you can go to FIFA and demand that they get disproportionate resources to develop sport. In the case of the World Cup, develop football or soccer. In the case of the Olympics, there are 30 different sports in the Summer Games. They should be getting disproportionately funded from the international organizations. That will make them better. That will get them more involved in the beautiful sport, and it will begin to rebalance the scales.
Closing thoughts, and then Professor Kyte.
Oh, thanks for organizing. I think it's been a great event. One of those that keep you going and thinking. That's something I think is a signal it's been so good. And two thoughts. One, I believe that the example of how football has impacted positively in gender equality and empowering women and making many girls believe not only that they can thrive in sport, but equally or even way better in many cases than men. I think it's demonstrates the power, the positive power that in this case football has, and that's the case. It is well orientated. It's a tool for good change in our societies. To the point that, for example, yesterday I saw a video of President Biden calling the male team, and I was very impressed. And I think that's because of the achievements of the females in the female team rather than the man team. It's become a big thing. And the second thought is, when listening to us having this conversation, I think sometimes we feel or we want FIFA or these organizations to be multilateral democratic institutions, accountable institutions, which they don't are at all. But even think of the United Nations. Come here, darling. Even think of the United Nations. I have 5 minutes. United Nations, it's still, with all its complexities and trying to make a better world, we have, how many years have we discussed reform within the United Nations to make it more democratic? And it's not the case. I mean, there's still the Security Council having the veto and so on and so forth. So if in the United Nations we have not achieved that, well, FIFA will be difficult. But yeah, I'm done.
Okay. So, Professor Kyte, your final thoughts, and then over to the Dean to close us out.
Thanks a lot, and thanks also to everyone for hanging out for this long on this. This has really been exciting. My attitude is, look, one sporting mega event is not going to fix all the problems of the world. And the idea of the contradiction that El Presidente refers to, I totally embrace, which is that it's okay for imperfect societies to host events that can make us happy, that can make all of us across the world actually revel in things that forget the problems of the world and for one moment get a release. Now, when this is all over, we'll return to the problem of fixing our countries. Foreigners will not fix our countries for us. The round leather object will not fix our countries for us. Our problems will be there. I'm not looking for footballers to fix Africa's problems or Ghana's or Cameroon's problems. But you know what? If we have our fun for 2 months or 1 month, and at the end of that, get the energy to return and start fighting Paul Biya, I love it. And I'll go for it. So Qatar is imperfect. And Qatar has a lot of problems. But in this World Cup, we have got a window to examine the problems of Qatar. And Qatar is not going to escape attention anymore for its imperfections. That, in my view, is the most positive thing I take from this World Cup, and long may it continue to happen to other imperfect societies that host mega sporting events.
So thank you very much to the panel. We've talked about politics and football, and when Tim Weir scored this afternoon, African Twitter, it's still working in Africa at the moment. It went crazy that it's finally a Weir could actually achieve something, but then it's a long story. So I'm very. It's funny when you ask the question about who do you think about. So for me, it's Rowdy Fowdy, because I've followed football since I can ever remember, and I used to go with my great uncle and stand on the terraces when I was very, very small. But Rowdy Fowdy, I could be her. I was too old because I'm about the same age as her, but but it was something very, very different to think that you could actually be her. I always wanted to play. I wasn't allowed to play. It was banned in our school. I went to an all-girls school. We were told when we were kicking the football around the playing field to actually stop, because they wanted us to play field hockey and things like that. So there's a difference about being able to see something and be able to be it. So there's a power to the beautiful game. We've just begun to explore. I think we have to separate out FIFA from Qatar, or FIFA from anywhere else. And I think maybe we should have a longer conversation about international sports governance, and then talk about where in the world we put these tournaments. So I hope you enjoy the next 27, 28 days of tournaments. We'll be showing them in and around the building. Please don't irritate professors by walking out of a class to catch, otherwise I'll be in trouble. But I think we know that some things unite us in ways that other things can't. And maybe for the next 27 to 28 days, we can find some unity and at least a space to have important and difficult conversations. So thank you all. There is food and drink outside, no Budweiser. And thank you to Tara for really pulling this all together.